I'm going to try and rattle through a few things. Firstly, talk about the size of the challenge. Secondly, thoroughly depress you by the current state of the investment market. I'll then try and explain some of the structural reasons why I think we're in the state we're in, and then try and finish on a nice positive note about a better future we can all build together. So what's the challenge? I think it's best put by Lord Kerslake, who wrote a great report on the levelling up agenda called Go Big or Go Home. And he's likened the challenge we have in levelling up our places to German reunification. German reunification cost 1.8 trillion euros. It was an enormous job. It's still not finished, but that's the scale of the challenge that we have. Unfortunately, it's happening at a time when we have an unparalleled poor investment market for investing in our town centres. There is effectively, on any reasonable scale, a buyer strike of investors in our town centres. Worse over, there is a strike by banks. Cass Business School and De Montfort University surveyed 34 lenders, only 2 would lend on retail at all. And there's £9.6 billion of retail property that needs refinancing next year. This is a massive problem by any standards. Now, clearly there are investments going into town centres and we should celebrate that. Local authorities are investing. There are notable local investors. I mean, Burntwood Works, for example, up in Manchester, to pay homage to my colleagues who all come from Manchester. You know, there's some brilliant local regional champions and they should be celebrated, but they're not going to solve the national problem. And of course, the government is taking this crisis seriously. The High Street Task Force, the Future High Street Fund was in place before COVID. And thank goodness, because it is going to be some of the only money going into our town centres in the short term, as in next year. I always love disagreeing with one of my panelists, especially one as esteemed as Mr. Millington. But on that axis that he showed about the way forward for investment, I might have missed it, or if I missed it, it was because it was too small, Steve. But just private investors, that's a bubble that should be there. And that's the only bubble that's going to do the heavy lifting. And the problem we have is we have a hostile environment to private investments at the moment. And this is something that I do share with anybody who listens to me, including government ministers. And there's 3 pillars of this hostile investment to investment. Firstly is our business taxation of retail property, business rates. I don't even need to tell people about it, but it is a massive inhibitor to investment, both by owners, occupiers, local authorities, entrepreneurs, everybody. It's a tax that doesn't work, it needs to go. Secondly, we have a massive problem with the insolvency regime in the UK. I'm not going to argue for the pros and cons of the moratorium. I think it's very understandable that it was put in place. CVAs will have all read about. This has created an environment where people don't feel safe investing in our high street anymore. And thirdly, we have an antiquated system of leasing space to occupiers, which is the death of entrepreneurialism and is the death of regeneration. The Landlord and Tenant Act, this whole feudal idea that landlords are these sort of twiddling mustachioed people and the tenants are the serfs, that needs to be got away with. We're people who are coming together to try and make our places better, and we need a legal framework which is going to support that pro-investment environment where we promote community uses, where we promote entrepreneurialism as well as long-term investment as well. And goodness knows we need a lot of long-term investment. So they're some of our challenges. But I'm positive about the future. I wouldn't have frankly agreed to get involved with the High Street Task Force unless I thought there was a positive future which we can play a part of. We need massive change. We have a gross oversupply of retail space that Steve talked about. Diane touched upon the amount of vacancy. I think that actually hides probably oversupply of up to 40 or 50% of retail space within many of our town centres. So we need to do something about that. Not everybody is a fan of the planning white paper. I think it has problems, challenges and issues, but it's a step in the right direction. We need flexible because we need to make dynamic moves fast to implement change in our places. And the only way we're going to implement change is by increasing capacity and expertise. And that's what all you guys are about. So what you are going to be doing in places across the UK is absolutely critical to encouraging this investment. I know this as a private investor. I will invest in places that have a plan, that have a vision, that show clear leadership. I'll invest in a town where the local authority has sold off their campus on the edge of town for housing, and they've bought the 1970s buildings in the middle of town to encourage 300-400 people who work in local government to use their town centres. that vision and that commitment to their town centre, which is the sort of work I very much hope you're going to be encouraging as experts, is the sort of thing that gives a really strong buy signal, as they call it, to the private sector to think this is a place where there's a vision, this is a place know where they're going, this is a place where they're backing it with their own money and their own commitment. Another really encouraging thing, and this is going to sound very odd coming from me, is retail rental values are plummeting and retail values are plummeting. And why is that a good thing? Well, it's not a good thing if you're an investor or bank, I hasten to add. But in terms of placemakers, this has to be a good thing. Steve touched upon this earlier. One of the problems, we ended up with these retail monocultures. Retail, because it was the most valuable use, drove out all of those fabulous uses that make our places special. And that's what we need to get right. And that values have to fall for these values to come, for these other uses to come back in. And purely in a retail sense, we talked about encouraging entrepreneurialism, and we talked about independent traders. If rents halve, if rents go down to 25% of what they once were, that's hopefully going to encourage a new wave of entrepreneurialism and independent retailers to take spaces in places that they never would have been able to have thought. That has to be a good thing. Things that are beyond retail use, because retail use is not the most valuable use, it means we can bring in those alternative uses that not only are the new anchors, but they will support the commerce, the footfall that retail needs to survive on. So let's not bemoan the fact that these retail monocultures, these clone towns that everybody hates, are no longer sustainable. Let's celebrate that, let's get rid of them, and let's bring in the uses which are often even more valuable, that can attract investment to make our places better. And finally, to end on an even more enthusiastic note, is I think some of the societal changes we're seeing as a result of COVID is leading to a much more holistic view of what we want from places. The rise of ideas such as community investing, social impact investing, that is resonating with the private sector as well. And I think we're heading towards a future where it's not about the public sector versus the private sector. We're heading towards a future where the things we want from place are aligned. There's a bit of work that the high street was to do about social impact investing and measuring that, the narrative. But I very much think that what we had was broken. Again, speaking to what Steve spoke to, we'd gone on for too long thinking that everything was okay, that if we built more retail, we could make our town better. That isn't the answer. One thing that COVID has done is made us all realise that that model is broken, which means we can get to the solutions that are so desperately needed a lot quicker than we otherwise would have been. Thank you.